Okay, take three. Welcome to Critical Wade Theory. So, today I'm going to be looking at the Deftones, but first I want to tell you about my new podcast. It's called Wade's Year by Year Flashback. I look at a different year in each episode, well, a different half of a year. So, the first episode is about the first half of the year 1981, which I chose because it's my birth year. And, it's a fun little flashback type of concept. I go over the major events of the given year, and I also go over trivia. I talk about the notable births and deaths of that year or that half of the year. And, it should be a little bit of a wave of nostalgia. Plus, you might learn a few things that you didn't know, and you might be able to, you know, enjoy my rants and raves about what happened and maybe even what didn't happen that year. So feel free to check it out. It's not a successful podcast yet, if it ever will be one. I'm still building the audience for it. And who knows, maybe you could be a part of that buildup. So go ahead and check it out. And without further ado, I'm going to talk about the Deftones now. So like I said, I'm talking about a band called the Deftones, and they never really fit the box that they were put in, and probably never wanted to fit that label. Deftones formed in 1988 in Sacramento, California, and on paper they came up in the same wave as late 90s nu metal, as it's called. But if you've listened to them for more than 5 minutes, you know that label never quite sticks, because Deftones don't really make heavy music that's like all the other bands. They make feeling heavy. They're a very emotion driven band and stuff like that. So there's a quote from The Edge of U2. He said, "Songs are indestructible. Bands have to be broken and rebuilt every time you go make an album." And that idea fits Deftones almost perfectly. Their core lineup stayed surprisingly stable for decades. You had Chino Moreno on vocals and guitar, Stephen Carpenter on guitar, Abe Cunningham on drums, and Frank Delgado on keys and turntables. And later, Sergio Vega stepped in on bass after the tragic loss of original bassist Chi Cheng. But even with that stability, the sound keeps shifting. Every album feels like a rebuild, at least if you ask the fans. And to be honest, I've only ever listened to one of their albums in full that I can recall. And I'm not saying that I'm the foremost expert on Deftones or anything like that, so you can take what I say with a grain of salt. So let's talk about where their sound comes from a little bit, or where people suggest that it comes from. Stephen Carpenter's origin story sounds like something out of a movie. At 15, he was hit by a car while skateboarding and spent months in a wheelchair. During the recovery, he taught himself guitar by playing along to bands like Metallica and Anthrax. And there's this long-running story that the accident settlement had funded the band's gear originally, though drummer Abe Cunningham has called that a myth. Still, it says something about how people understand Deftones. Pain, transformation, and creation are always tied together with this band. So, what makes them different? Yes, they were grouped with bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit, which, frankly, a lot of people would reject. They don't want to necessarily be lumped in with other bands. And in fact, the band Rage Against the Machine also seems to not want to be regarded as nu metal. So, this is not something that's entirely unique to Deftones. There's always going to be some band out there who rejects the label that the mainstream media will put on them. But it happens. That's just how things go. You've always had people calling bands a genre that just doesn't necessarily fit. But even early on, people close to the scene would say they had nothing in common with those other bands, because Deftones pull from two extremes at once. On one side, there's this heavy, down-tuned riff, hardcore energy, and raw aggression thing happening. And on the other, there's this dreamy, textural, shoegaze atmosphere and almost weightless melodies. So it's a very interesting mix of that aggression, but also melody and mood. And right in the middle is Chino Moreno's voice, shifting from a whisper to a scream, and sometimes in the same line. It's that contrast that defines them: soft turning violent, beautiful turning ugly, then back again. And they do it in sort of a unique way. I know other bands do this loud, quiet, loud dynamic. Of course, Nirvana's famous for that. But Deftones, they sound different from Nirvana. There's just something unique about them. They kind of stand out in a musical lineup. And so if you look at their albums, there is an evolution, at least if you ask the fans. Their debut, Adrenaline, is raw and aggressive. You can hear a hunger there. It's a band that's trying to prove something. I guess you could say, like a lot of scrappy upstart bands, they end up trying to sound aggressive when it comes to rock music. And that album is probably more aggressive than some of their other ones. Then you have Around the Fur, which is sometimes considered tighter, sharper, and more confident. Songs like My Own Summer, Shove It, and Be Quiet and Drive Far Away, they're defining tracks. Even if you're not a huge Deftones fan, you may have heard those songs somewhere. And that album went platinum, and the audience was already locked in. But the real turning point for some people is White Pony, and this is where everything opens up. It's heavier in some ways, but also more spacious and a bit more experimental. You get tracks like Change in the House of Flies and Digital Bath, songs that feel cinematic and maybe a little bit surreal. And this album didn't just succeed, it really sort of redefined what people thought the band could be. I mean, Change in the House of Flies, it's a good song. I think I can't really say exactly what's great about it, but it's just atmospheric. I love the sort of natural progression there. Nothing sounds forced. It kind of sounds like a living creature that just exists, and I think that natural feel is really a part of what makes a lot of songs great. And after that, things seem to get darker at times. Deftones is dense and moody. So you've got Saturday Night Wrist, which feels tense and fractured, according to the fans again. And you can hear the internal struggles, or at least some people tell you that those are detectable in those songs. And then a major turning point: after Chi Chang's accident, the band returns with Diamond Eyes, which is focused and powerful, and you might say it's like a reset. And from there, Koi no Yokan, it's expansive, emotional, and lush. Again, according to the fans, Ohms is a late career high point, which balances the melody and the weight of the band. And throughout all of this, they never sound like they're chasing trends. That's another thing that makes a band great. If they just sound like they're doing their own thing. That's what some of the greatest bands do of all time. They are innovators rather than just trend chasers. And there's also this interesting detail. Their song Elite won a Grammy for Best Metal Performance, but if you know their catalog, that track barely captures their full range. That's the thing about Deftones. Any single song only tells part of the story. So their tone is, just all over the place, but in a good way. They're one of the few bands from the late 90s wave that didn't fade out or become a mere nostalgia act. Instead, they influenced a whole new generation of bands that mix heaviness with atmosphere and emotion and texture